Okay, I think we'll begin now. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us for this timely discussion on the narco-terrorism threat. My name is Anne Fordham. I'm the Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Consortium, and I would like to thank our co-organizers, Amnesty International, Connect Us, and the Washington Office on Latin America. Today, we have an excellent panel of experts who will discuss the different uses of the narco-terrorism concept. And I hope our conversation will explore how the international community should respond in order to uphold international law. You will have noticed that the word narco-terrorism comes in quotation marks in the title of the event. This is because narco-terrorism does not exist in reality, but it does exist in the words and narratives of some governments, and therefore we need to pay attention to it. We have all followed in shock the US military strikes in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific in the last 3 months, which have now claimed over 80 lives. The goal of today's conversation is to zoom out and draw the connection between these developments and other uses of the narco-terrorism concept, whether they may be in Brazil, in Ecuador, or in other parts of the world. Ultimately, we want this to be a conversation for everyone involved in drug policy. We know that the US attacks are largely driven by geopolitical considerations. However, they have been portrayed as operations against drug trafficking organizations. Sadly, this is not an unprecedented or unique situation in that regard. History is littered with similar examples which have led to brutal violations of human rights. Drug control bodies need to respond. The wider international community needs to respond. So without further ado, some housekeeping. This event is in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. Please choose your language of preference using the menu at the bottom of the Zoom page. There will be ample time for Q&A discussion at the end. Please add your questions to the Q&A function, and I will aim to address them to our panelists. We will start today with an intervention by Ben Saul, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Ben unfortunately couldn't join us live because he's currently in Australia and the event would be too late for him, but he's kindly sent a pre-recorded message that will be screened right now.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to join you from Sydney to mark International Human Rights Day. Today, I unequivocally condemn the United States' extrajudicial killings of at least 87 people in unprovoked military attacks on 23 boats on the high seas since September this year. The US appears to claim that drug traffickers are attacking the United States by causing thousands of drug deaths each year, and that there is a non-international armed conflict with cartels it has declared as terrorist organizations. Neither the US president's executive order reportedly authorizing the attacks nor any US government legal opinions has been published. The US legal claims are utterly absurd. The widespread international legal consensus is that there is no basis whatsoever in international law for these killings. International law does not allow governments to simply murder alleged drug traffickers at sea, just as police could not execute them on the streets of New York or Washington, D.C. Under international law, all countries must respect the human right to life, including when acting on the high seas or in foreign territory. The use of potentially lethal force is normally only permitted in personal self-defense or defense of others against an imminent threat to life. The US's attack also violates the international law of the sea. Foreign flagged vessels may not be intercepted without the consent of the flag state, including where suspected of drug trafficking. While stateless ships may be intercepted, the law of the sea requires a law enforcement response, that is, the graduated use of force as a last resort to stop a vessel or in personal self-defense or defense of others. There is no power to militarily attack and sink ships on site. The US has even admitted it could have, but chose not to, intercept some of the ships. Military force may only be exceptionally used in national self-defense against an armed attack. Drug cartels are obviously not mounting an armed military attack on the US. They are selling drugs, which people in the US choose to consume. Deaths by overdose are not a military attack. The US previously accused the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua of mounting an invasion or predatory incursion of the US at the behest of the Venezuelan government when invoking the archaic Alien Enemies Act to summarily deport foreigners to El Salvador. Even if it were true that Venezuela directed this group, it is not engaged in a military attack, so any question of self-defense is irrelevant. In July this year, the US designated Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist group and alleged that the Venezuelan president is its leader, raising the prospect that the US may use force against a foreign government, again on the false pretense of self-defense against a non-existent attack. This would be a clear breach of the prohibition on the use of force under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and would likely constitute a criminal act of aggression by US leaders. Attacks on organised crime groups in foreign territory would also violate the other country's sovereignty and could amount to an illegal use of force under the UN Charter and customary international law. The US is also plainly not involved in a non-international armed conflict with drug cartels or any other gangs or criminal groups so as to engage the targeting rules of international humanitarian law. An armed conflict requires intense military hostilities between the parties, which do not exist. The military violence here is entirely one way. The US military is murdering civilians at sea. The recent so-called double tap strike on wounded, shipwrecked sailors is not a war crime for this reason. There is no war to begin with. International law also does not recognize any other powers to unilaterally use force abroad to fight terrorism or drug trafficking. I urge the US to retreat from its lawless war on narcoterrorism. Under international law, the US must independently investigate those who ordered and carried out these murders, prosecute the perpetrators, no matter how senior in the government, provide reparation to the victims' families, and guarantee that such acts will never reoccur. Regrettably, the last year or two have seen a growing number of countries in the Americas declare drug cartels or gangs as terrorist organizations. In addition to the US, these include Canada, Ecuador, Argentina, and Paraguay, and current proposals in Honduras and Brazil. Listing these groups aims to maximize legal powers against them, publicly stigmatize them, and increase pressure on other countries to cooperate to suppress them. Drug trafficking can and should be addressed by the existing, more appropriate international and domestic legal frameworks governing organised crime. The UN Transnational Organised Crime Convention 2000 and its 3 protocols, along with the Narcotics Conventions, criminalise various organised criminal offences, including participation in an organised criminal group, provide for extraterritorial jurisdiction, and enable law enforcement information sharing, mutual assistance, and extradition, all while safeguarding human rights. To the extent that stronger powers or new tools are needed to keep pace with the scale or changing nature of organised crime, the appropriate response is to proportionately tailor and adapt these organised crime legal frameworks, not to escalate the response to falsely classify organised crime as terrorism or even as warfare. There are certainly links between some terrorist groups and some organised crime groups. Drug trafficking is one of the most common organised crimes committed by terrorist groups to finance their operations. Other crimes include illicit trafficking in cultural property, illicit exploitation of natural resources and environmental crimes, and kidnapping for ransom. These activities of some terrorist groups can clearly come within the organised crime legal frameworks. However, the activities of organised crime groups will rarely qualify as terrorism. The key legal distinction is that the Transnational Organised Crime Convention defines organised crime as essentially crime for profit, that is, crime for a financial or other material benefit. During the drafting of the convention, it was the US itself who indicated that this profit motive is what distinguishes crimes under the convention from terrorism. In contrast, terrorism is essentially political or ideological violence, as indicated by the consensus of the United Nations General Assembly in its 1994 Declaration on Measures to Eliminate International Terrorism. Terrorism is not always more dangerous than organized crime, but it is a qualitatively different threat. Each type of crime requires customized legal frameworks, not least to ensure that inappropriate powers and tools are not misused when they are not justified. It is true that some drug cartels and gangs use violence to terrorize or intimidate parts of the population, or to coerce or compel governments to do something, which are legal elements of many definitions of terrorism, including under the Terrorist Financing Convention, Security Council Resolution 1566, and my mandate's own 2010 model definition of terrorism. However, organised crime typically lacks the additional element of a political motive, which is a defining characteristic of terrorism. The human rights compliant response to the challenge of transnational organised crime is to make effective use of multilateral law enforcement cooperation tools, including the Transnational Organised Crime Convention, and bilateral cooperation by building relationships of mutual trust and benefit with other states. Indeed, the US has a long history of effective cooperation with states in the region, including building the capacity of foreign law enforcement partners and partnering with them in consensual enforcement operations. The US could also do much more to preventively address the root causes of organised crime. It needs to seriously confront the demand side of drug use in the US through prevention, education, and public health initiatives. It may need to consider decriminalisation strategies to destroy the profitability of the cartel's business model, given that cartels have continued to grow more powerful despite decades of expensive and increasingly militarized suppression efforts, and more people in the US have meanwhile fallen victim to addiction, ill health, and death. Crucially, the US also needs to regulate the licit and illicit trade in powerful US-made weapons of war that fuel cartel violence and corrode political systems in Latin America and in the US itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Ben Saul for providing us with that pre-recorded video. I encourage all of you to look through the forceful interventions that the Special Rapporteur has provided in the last months on the US strikes, which delineate a very clear distinction between organized crime and terrorism. For many of us, it has been quite remarkable how the human rights system of the UN has been strongly calling out the attacks perpetrated by the Trump administration, while the drug control bodies have stayed silent. Our next speaker will be John Walsh, who is the Director for Drug Policy and the Andes at the Washington Office on Latin America. John has been a relentless advocate against the US war on drugs in Latin America. He will provide an overview of the US military strikes, and he'll draw connections with other elements of the Trump administration's international drug policy. He will also touch on the implications of these developments for international cooperation on drug control. John, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Anne and IDPC, for spearheading this event. I'm really happy to be here, although the topic is very daunting. I think Special Rapporteur Ben Saul gave a very admirable and thorough overview of the issues, especially the legal issues, but also touching on policy. So what I'm going to do, with some help from some slides, is to discuss more the U.S. policy, as well as how I think the agenda on the boat strikes and the Armada currently in the Caribbean may be connected to other agenda items for the Trump administration. So I'm going to start with the good news, which has been sort of lost in the furor of the boat strikes and the militarization, the remilitarization of U.S. drug policy, is that the supposed cause of these attacks, meaning fentanyl overdoses, and in particular the rise in overdoses over the last 40 years, we've finally seen in the United States that overdoses are going down. They're still unacceptably and tragically high, but they are going down. starting in 2023 cumulatively at the national level. There are many reasons for that. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention points to, in particular, the idea that an expansion of public health approaches, including harm reduction, such as naloxone distribution and drug testing strips, has contributed to this decline in overdoses. Again, the first that the United States has seen in 40 years. So that's the good news. On the other hand, the number of deaths is still shockingly high and needs to come down. And the question is whether the incipient decline can be sustained. And in that sense, what the Trump administration is actually doing in coordination with the Congress is slashing the public health services that have contributed to this decline in overdoses. So in particular, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed earlier this year um, with the votes of the Republican Congress cuts Medicaid, which is the primary provider of funding for substance use disorder treatment and prevention, has been slashed by $1 trillion over the next 10 years. In addition, the Trump administration is slashing support for state funds through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and other programs. So, to the extent that fentanyl overdose in particular is meant to be driving these attacks in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, it's at odds with what the Trump administration and the Republican-led Congress is actually doing at home to address those overdoses. That said, I think the Trump administration has decided that the real anger and grief about overdose in the United States can be weaponized. And I think they have decided to attach that to their other agendas around immigration and mass deportation to construct a narrative that the only way to solve this problem is to go on the offensive militarily. So next slide, please. And that leads us to this, what we can safely call an armada of U.S. force in the Caribbean. The boat that you're looking at is the USS Gerald R. Ford, which the Navy describes on its website as the most capable, adaptable, and lethal combat platform in the world, maintaining the Navy's capacity to project power on a global scale through sustained operations at sea. This massive aircraft carrier is the largest in the world. The Trump administration has ordered it from Europe and the Middle East over to the Caribbean Sea, where it is parked off of mostly the coast of Venezuela. So that aircraft carrier, all the planes on it, suggest that indeed the United States is at war. The Special Rapporteur Saul explained very clearly there is no war. We are at peacetime, and therefore the boat strikes and all the people killed, 87, those are illegal, those are lawless, and those amount to murders. So I'll discuss a bit more of the policy issues that are involved here. In one sense, this level of military hardware and use of force, which makes people think that there is war, is dramatic overkill to what they're actually doing. So if you think of drug interdiction and you think of targeting even 22 boats, it is really a drop in the bucket of the amount of drugs that are trafficked to serve a U.S. and other markets. And it's little noticed, but it's worth mentioning that at the same time as these boat strikes, which are supposedly meant to prevent drugs from reaching the United States and prevent overdose, the U.S. Coast Guard in fiscal 2025 suggested that it had interdicted the most drugs probably ever, the most cocaine, 250 metric tons. That had nothing to do with these boat strikes, but everything to do with the lawful, although of limited effect, interdiction campaigns that the United States Coast Guard, with the assistance of the Navy, has been conducting for decades. So, on the one hand, these boat strikes are dramatic overkill, and on the other hand, the Trump administration's focus on this sort of kinetic force is radically inadequate to the true problems. On the one hand, at home, the domestic questions and the slashing of public health and harm reduction programs. On the other hand, organized crime is a serious problem. And drug trafficking is a deeply networked, resilient, uh, uh, facet of organized crime. And these militarized kinetic approaches have almost nothing to do with the law enforcement and intelligence sharing approaches that are needed to solve it. Next slide, please. So this, with credit to the BBC, shows where the strikes have occurred. The boat strikes have occurred. Initially, they were mostly in the Caribbean, and the Trump administration was claiming, without any basis at all, that they were, targeting boats that were carrying fentanyl. There is no fentanyl coming from Venezuela or anywhere else in South America. So that was completely baseless. Um, the boat strikes have now been increasingly, however, in the Eastern Pacific and targeting cocaine. And in that case, it's worth mentioning another huge contradiction between the idea that the United States, through these boat strikes, is preventing cocaine from reaching the United States, and contrasting that with President Trump's recent full pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was convicted in U.S. courts and sentenced to 45 years in prison for his role as president in facilitating the shipment of 400 tons of cocaine to the United States. So there's a huge contradiction again if you believe that the Trump administration is using this policy actually to prevent cocaine from reaching the United States, and at the same time, Trump is fully pardoning a president of Honduras who facilitated massive flows of cocaine to the United States. So next slide, please. Just to get a sense of what's occurring, it's reported that most of the strikes that are happening on the drug boats, at least in the Caribbean and perhaps in the Pacific as well, have been carried out by Reaper drones. So this is why they call these standoff strikes. There are operators who are remote, operating those drones, doing the surveillance, and then pressing the button to send the missile for a strike. Um, the controversy in Washington recently has been around the first strike on September 2nd, because there were survivors and there may have been orders from Secretary of Defense Hegseth to kill everybody on board, and that the commander, the admiral in charge of giving the orders for the strikes, did order a second strike to kill people who had survived the first strike and were in distress. So that's where the confusion has come in the Washington debate about whether a war crime may have been committed. But to be very clear, we're not at war. This is peacetime. That second strike that killed those people was straight out murder, just like all of the other attacks. So next slide, please. Excuse me. Which means that as we discuss these ongoing strikes, we should treat each one of them, in the videos that the administration is posting, the mentions on social media that they're posting about giving the orders to conduct them, as crime scenes, and begin to think about this more forensically, from a legal point of view, but also in terms of down the road, sooner or later, there needs to be, as Special Rapporteur Saul suggested, there needs to be accountability for these acts. Next slide, please. In that sense, it's really interesting that in the US Congress, two senators and four representatives in the House of Representatives issued a video a couple of weeks ago where they said that service members, people in the US military, can and must refuse illegal orders. This seems to be stating the obvious, and indeed it is. That's been the case for forever, that U.S. soldiers are trained that if there is a patently unlawful order, they're not just allowed to, but they must refuse to obey it. President Trump declared that these people were engaged in sedition and were traitors and need to be tried, and even threatened capital punishment that they be killed. That suggests how polarized the debate has become over this. It also indicates that members of Congress, in particular Democrats, but even some Republicans these days, are beginning to ask tougher questions and to push back. Next slide. And that brings me to questions of the broader Trump agenda, in terms of using the military in this way and connecting it to the domestic politics of both the immigration debate, but also Trump's interest in bending the military, or at least segments of it, to his will. And in that regard, it's disturbing to note that on the U.S. Southern Command's X account has appeared this image to tout Southern Spear, which is the name of the operation of the boat strikes in the Caribbean, where this montage image, which includes a soldier with a helmet, if you look closely where I've marked in red, there is what is called a Jerusalem cross or Crusader's cross, which is a symbol with a long history but has recently been adopted by a symbol among some white supremacist groups. Not coincidentally, I think Secretary of Defense Hegseth has a tattoo of this Jerusalem or Crusader's cross, and it appears on this helmet, which is purportedly the helmet of a U.S. soldier. And I think it's disturbing because it's a symbol that might go unrecognized by most, but is clearly a sign of a white supremacist agenda that has no place in an official U.S. military posting, but is clearly there and meant to send a message to people for whom that may be significant and attractive. And I'll just close to say that it seems to be that the Trump administration is achieving one of its goals, and the goal of President Trump, which eluded him in his first term, which is to have a military that does exactly what he wants it to do. In his first term, he was frustrated in that regard, and in his second term, with Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, and at least elements of the military showing themselves willing to carry out orders that do seem to be patently unlawful, he's achieving a a goal of having a portion of the military at least being willing to obey unlawful orders. And in that regard, it's important to note that the legal justifications, such as they are, that the administration has offered for these lethal strikes in the Caribbean have no limiting principle, meaning that territorially or in time, if President Trump declares someone to be part of a group that is on a foreign terrorist organization list or otherwise worthy of being targeted by the United States, the U.S. can target that person, whether they be in Chicago or whether they be in Caracas. And I think that should be worrisome for everybody. So I'll conclude there, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Um, and stark words there about how this situation should be worrisome for everyone. And yeah, indeed, a devastating lack of accountability is unfolding before us. So thank you also for your very useful and insightful analysis of what has been happening with respect to the US military strikes in the Caribbean. Um, I recommend that people check out WOLA's extremely useful work on US military intervention in the Southern Caribbean, Eastern Pacific, which we will now link to in the chat. So moving on to our next panelists, it's my pleasure to introduce Giselle Martins, a journalist, filmmaker, community communicator, researcher, and human rights activist. She's also a resident at Complexo da Maré, a favela in Rio de Janeiro. It's important to remember that only last month, an extremely violent police raid took place in Rio, which was meant to capture the head of a criminal gang, which left at least 120 people dead. Giselle has written about militarization, censorship, and human rights violations, and among other things, she will explain how the concept of narcoterrorism has been used in Brazil and how it links with authoritarian and racist practices. Giselle, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Giselle. I am a community communicator from Maré Favela on the north zone of Rio de Janeiro. Here in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro is historically a laboratory of a death policy, a deadly policy of populations, especially people who live in the favelas, in the slums. The favela that I live in, the Complexo da Maré, is around the main highways of the city and international airports. So it is a favela that always suffers with police incursions. We have at least 40 police operations per year, and we have the life in the favela paralyzed. And what happens at Maré ends up being also the case of other favelas in Rio de Janeiro and in the country. In Rio de Janeiro, we have 40 years of re-democratization of our country, of so-called Brazilian democracy, but we in the favelas have never experienced it. I say that we have never experienced this democracy because there is a continuity of the military practices within these territories. Military police is a type of police that during the colonization uh, took care of the coffee crops. BOP is specialized in the art of killing, but killing who? Black people, people from the favelas, inhabitants of these territories that are impoverished by these Brazilian states, by the Brazilian governments. And since the democratization of Brazil, when I say there's a continuity of this dictatorship, because we continue suffering from the slaughters, such as that which has happened last year at Complexo da Penha and Complexo do Alemão. We still suffer with police operations, with forced missing people within these territories that have overall a black community as majority. So we have remnants of this politicization of racism. And these people live in the favelas and don't have right to water, but it is a government that spend public resources to buy weapons and to weaponize themselves. In Favela da Maré, 10 years ago, we had war tanks. We have in our daily lives, we have bulletproof cars of the police. We have drones, we have surveillance equipment, weapons that come from other countries, such as Israel, for instance, to kill our Black youth. And when I say that this government, Rio de Janeiro, state governments continue with their practices of a military dictatorship, is that always, right before the elections, they invent a slaughter. And the idea is to place fear in Rio de Janeiro, to make society feel fearful and fearful of what? The Black community, the black youth, and they slaughter with the help of the media because Brazil has not yet re-democratized the media. It is in the same hands of the same colonels that were in charge of dictatorship, and the media spreads fear. And then we have a society that applauds this slaughter, that applauds these military interventions within these territories that are the favelas of where I live, for instance. So always in the beginning of the elections, right before the elections, they do a slaughter to mediate their popularity. Claudio Castro, for instance, who was a protagonist of this last slaughter, he increased his likes on Instagram, and he wanted to bring a new invention of a militarization. They always bring extraordinary politics of for control of the favelas, surveillance of the favelas. He wanted to ensure law and order, military intervention again in our favelas in Rio de Janeiro with weapon apparatus, spending public funds to buy weapons. Our luck was that this time the federal government did not begin a new dictatorship in our democracy. They did not place war tanks in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro again, just as we had in 2018 back in the Bolsonaro administration and when we had 2014 also in the Dilma administration. This slaughter carried out by Claudio Castro one day after the slaughter came up with a term saying that those people that had been assassinated were narco terrorists. This is one more invention of a term to make society applaud this type of genocide, a massacre within the favelas. That is, they wanted the Brazilian population, this black population that is already criminalized, that is already seen as criminals, and they wanted this population to be seen as narco terrorists. So that is a even greater dehumanization of this black youth, of this black favela inhabitants, so that people applaud this genocide and these massacres. And this is a way to internationalize massacre and the dehumanization of bodies that in Brazil are black bodies, impoverished bodies, indigenous bodies, but internationally, and we have been seeing this for the past 3 years. Dehumanization of Palestinian bodies. So in Palestine, they are terrorists. In Brazil, they are narco terrorists. That is a way of dehumanizing bodies so that population can applaud and invest in weapons and supports weaponizing and the genocide of these populations. And in Brazil, as I mentioned, we have a media that supports this type of genocide. We have other types of control beyond militarization, which is the ideological control, and we have people who live in more noble neighborhoods saying that, yes, we need to end with favela and black population in our territories. That is, this is not a issue that happens every now and then. This is a policy of militarization and a policy of dehumanization of black bodies, of people who live in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. And then beyond calling these more than 100 people killed narco terrorists, the government of Rio de Janeiro and their media said that those who were defending human rights and defending the humanization of these bodies that were killed and they were on the ground, they were defending narco terrorists. Community communicators such as myself or human rights organizations as defenders of narco terrorists. So this is an augmentation of a scaling up of criminalization of those who are dying, those who are living in the favelas, but those who are human rights defenders as well. And then to close, I would like to say that this is a policy of extermination, of genocide in Rio de Janeiro that has never stopped practicing this militarization. We have in Rio de Janeiro a state that is more and more militarized in terms of surveillance as well, and we know which are the bodies that are constantly being surveilled. They are the black bodies, they are the black youth. We have a state that spends money buying Israeli weapons, Israeli war things, helicopters that shoot our streets, but they cannot give the right to education, right to water, right to decent living, housing, right to work of these people who live in the favelas. We don't have water in the favelas yet, but we have helicopters shooting our streets in the favelas and including our schools as well. 2 weeks ago, a child at Maré was targeted by a helicopter that was shooting a school, and it hit the leg of this child. Not to mention other Black youth that was assassinated because they were just working. Anybody within this impoverished Black territory is a targeted body, and this is a specific policy. It is not by accident. It always happens within the favelas and within our peripheries, the outskirts of the city. I'd like to close by saying that what we have been doing as a favela movement, as a Black movement, and human rights organizations, so that we can, in fact, at least account for that, trying to revert this narrative that we are narco terrorists or defenders of narco terrorists. We have been working on reports, accounting for data, data collection with name, last name, profession, because most of the time we have a government and administration that does not say the name and last name and who were these people. This is also a form of dehumanizing these bodies after they have been killed. They don't have a name, they don't have a last name. So we do data collection, we do report writing, we insist with forensic work that is independent, because in Brazil we don't have that yet. We want to know which are the weapons that are killing, what are the devices, who are the companies that are arriving in Brazil to kill people. So the movement of the favelas have been doing that today, and that way we can connect this militarization with what Venezuela is suffering, Colombia, Mexico, Mapuche in Chile, Argentina. Today we can understand what are the weapons that are killing in the world. In fact, this is not just a project in Rio de Janeiro and in Brazil. This is a militarization project of control of the bodies, internationally speaking. I would say that this is a modern type colonization, and more they bring militarization and bring corporations that are trying to control the narrative, but also control these population, that these states, that capitalism impoverishes, because we know we are resisting, they know we are in these territories that could um be going against all of this, but they buy weaponized equipment to control us, to keep us from fighting. In Alemão and other favelas, we were still able to revolt in the past and protest in the past. And today we can't anymore because of this discourse that we are defenders of narco terrorists, but also because we have helicopters shooting us. And so we cannot protest in the favelas anymore. We cannot protest against the slaughter the moment that it is happening, to ask them to stop, because there is a helicopter shooting us real time. There are drones shooting us real time. And so even our revolt, our rebellion, while the slaughter is happening, we cannot close Avenida Brasil. We cannot close a highway anymore. And so we have to report, to write reports. We have to put name, last name. We need to access the media, the same media that is controlled by colonels that say that they are criminals, they are bandits, and legitimizing this massacre. We do popular cinema, popular theater, and political training in our favelas, so that we don't believe this narrative that we are bodies to be killed, as we have been killed for the past 1500 years, because these policies have not changed. So we have been resisting and self-organizing in the ways that we can with human rights organizations, writing reports locally, nationally, and internationally, and complaints and whistleblowing on it, so that we can at least try to decrease all these weapons that are arriving at us, so that we so that this situation that the circumstances does not get worse and worse, not only in Brazil, but in the whole Latin America. Thank you.
Obrigada, Giselle. Gosh, I'm almost speechless listening to you. Thank you so much for being with us and for your intervention and for your work and for your courage in speaking out. And we're so grateful that you could be here today with us to make these really important links also between what is happening with the US strikes and also what has been happening on the streets of Rio. It's very stark, some of the comparisons, especially, of course, around the dehumanization of Black bodies, of impoverished bodies, of indigenous bodies, but also where the state chooses to spend its resources on militarization, on weapons, and rather on, in the US, for example, the cuts to Medicaid, and in Rio, in the favelas, the lack of access to water and education and basic services. So thank you so much for being with us. Um, Please, I encourage colleagues to follow Giselle on social media in order to better understand the situation there with the ongoing militarization in Rio. We're now adding a link to her Instagram page in the chat. So, last but not least today, I would like to introduce Daniel Norana, who is the Advocacy Director for the Americas at Amnesty International USA. He's also a lecturer in law at George Washington University. Daniel will present on the connections between US policies and the rise of militarization across the Americas and will lay out some possibilities for holding the Trump administration accountable at both national and international level. Daniel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and I would like to thank IDPC on behalf of Amnesty International for allowing me to be in this space. My name is Daniel Noroña. I am the Americas Advocacy Director at Amnesty USA, the US section of the movement. As you may know, Amnesty International is a global movement of around 10 million people where we fight for the protection and promotion of human rights all over the world. I would just like to start this presentation framing the discussion and noting that in Latin America, especially, but in other countries as well, this term specifically of narcoterrorism has been used to justify the use of military and paramilitary forces, which often result in extrajudicial killings and many other human rights violations. This is despite clear evidence that conflating drug trafficking and terrorism is factually inaccurate and can lead basically to misguided and harmful responses. Um, More accurately, within Amnesty International, what we have advocated for a long time is to really stop the flow of drugs. We have to really go into the deep root causes, which have actually promoted for many people to go into this business, we will say. This basically mean to tackle poverty, lack of opportunities, and structural issues that impact these communities that fuel the ranks of organized crime. Added to this, we have structural issues at the statewide level, which will be some things like corruption, impunity, and the disregard for the rule of law in general. In response to this general situation, what we saw since September is that the US has been carrying these attacks, which are basically murder. For us, this is murder, plain and simple. The US is not in an armed conflict. I would like to get that from the get-go. So laws of war and humanitarian law should not be applied to this situation. And the use of force can only be used when it's necessary for the protection of life. Once these attacks happened, we saw a lot of condemnation from UN mechanisms, from civil society organizations, but in the US, it also came from a lot of members of Congress and from senators as well. In this is only because it was very doubtful the legality of the attacks, but there was little evidence that was shown by the administration on why these attacks were done in general. This has been very controversial within the US government, that the main commander of Southcom of the US Southern Command quit after almost not even being a year in the post. He has now been called to testify before the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Armed Services Committee as well, to testify what he has been doing in this sense. Uh, Given this context, I would like to just focus my presentation on the two main issues. First, to understand how legal this is in the context of international law, but more specifically within the context of U.S. law, to then see what accountability mechanisms we can have to actually hold some of the people accountable under what this has happened. First, again, to reiterate, is that the intentionally killing of people accused of committing crimes, and this is very important, they're just being accused, they're not even being charged in any other format, is basically murder. Full stop. This is unlawful under both US law and under international law as well. Tackling drug trafficking and stopping suspected drug boats are law enforcement operations. Therefore, this is something that the Coast Guard in the United States has been doing for a long time. That's what they have been doing. They have been tasked to do. And what we have been seeing is basically something out of that normal procedure, for example. These are operations that must be subject to international human rights law, nor international humanitarian law, and basically means that these people should be respected their right to life and their due process rights as well. The Caribbean and Eastern Pacific are not war zones, and the military cannot bomb just that place at their will. Deploying the army on these alleged groups are basically a failed tactic from the authoritarian playbook. We always see authoritarianism or authoritarian practices always being partnered with this type of high-rising militarization in law enforcement activities. These airstrikes are sending a chilling message of tacit approval to the rest of countries in the region who are using this type of actions. We as Amnesty International and other civil society organizations have already documented the impacts of militarized drug policies in the region. As Giselle just said before me, and she was recounting the horrible operation in Rio de Janeiro a couple of weeks ago, where more than 100 deaths were confirmed. And also, for example, in Ecuador, Amnesty International has documented the enforced disappearance of people at the hands of the military in the context of the Plan Phoenix security strategy of President Noboa. In both of these cases, what we are seeing is that intent of the government to trying to seize or trying to control these drug trafficking operations through military means. But what they have conveyed is actually more human rights violations. Actually, today we're commemorating 1 year of the disappearances of one of the most, I would say, the most recognizable case in Ecuador, which is the case of the 4 kids of the Malvinas neighborhood in Guayaquil. These are 4 kids who were detained by members of the Air Force in Ecuador, and they are currently under trial. The prosecutor yesterday asked the judge for 34 years in prison for each of the 17 members of this group of the armed forces who kidnapped these kids and eventually murdered them. These are the type of stories that we are listening all over Ecuador, for example, in this case. And this has been added also to the first disappearances that we have documented in Mexico, and as well to the cases of arbitrary detention and deaths in custody that we have seen also, for example, in El Salvador. So in this sense of the legality of the attacks, it's important to attest that the president of the United States can use force whether there is a congressional authority to use it, or a declaration on war in this case, or there is an authority under Article 2 of the Constitution when the US president can use that force and afterwards inform Congress. So when they can use this force without congressional authorization, it has been contemplated that it has to advance a national interest, and this must amount to the constitutional sense of war. which this is something that the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice of the United States has usually interpreted as. But in this case, for example, when the United States has engaged in this type of military actions without obtaining the prior congressional authorization, then it must be reported to Congress. And this Congress then has the ability to either continue these operations or to cease these operations. This is called the War Powers Resolution, and this is framed under the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973. So if these actions happens, then the executive has the obligation to report this to Congress. Congress within 48 hours, and it has to terminate these actions in 60 days unless Congress authorizes to continue with this operation. We're just nearing the 60-day frame, and that's why we're seeing in the news this type of briefings continuing to both chambers in Congress in the United States. And that's why, for example, we have now two war power resolutions that have been introduced in both chambers, both by Republican and Democrats alike. In this sense, what we are seeing is that what we are having is no matter what legislative or legal vehicle is being used, there is avenues for accountability. So given that these are international crimes, these are crimes that are contemplated under international human rights law, we could argue that there are avenues either domestically and also internationally to try to find accountability. So, for example, at the domestic level, these are murders and they have to be treated as murders. So Executive Order 12-333 from the executive prohibits assassinations from the U.S. Army, which says that no person employed by or acting on behalf of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in assassination. So basically is the targeted killing of any individual. To that end, it falls under the Department of Justice to begin all the investigations and prosecute to the full extent of the law those responsible for these actions, including those with command responsibility. So we must ask for the Department of Justice to actually begin these investigations. Of course, we understand the reality in which we're facing right now, where the independence of the Department of Justice has been severely undermined. Nonetheless, they still have congressional and constitutional responsibilities that they must be executed. Additionally, there are also avenues in the congressional level that they could initiate as part of these accountability mechanisms that can be created through the consideration of a war powers resolution or under other mechanisms. The oversight capacity of the Congress must be called into action. There have been now proposals that the committees who have jurisdictions, which will be, in this case, probably the Armed Services Committee, should begin doing their own investigations, but there has also been calls to form special subcommittees. So these will be, subcommittees will be created for the sole purpose of investigating these type of specific actions, and they will usually fall under the jurisdiction of one of these main committees. For example, one of the subcommittees that recently took place was the January 6th Special Subcommittee, for example. Or we have also a subcommittee also that is solely based on China, for example, and Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere and in the world. So those are two avenues that could be granted for example, getting some political responsibility in this case. And also, once they have a decision, they could also call for criminal charges as well. Then we have international avenues, and perhaps here's the tricky, because it's important to note that once the stop work orders were decided by the State Department back, as you remember, at the end of January of this year, beginning of February, a lot of the international capacity to actually use these type of mechanisms was really diminished. So it's concerning to see what can these organisms actually do. Nonetheless, I think it's important to still try to call on these mechanisms to activate their jurisdiction and act upon these different issues. One of the things will be, for example, they use the UPR. Sadly, the United States was not present at the UPR this year. It was their chance to appear before the Human Rights Council and perform the UPR. This was rescheduled for next year, and we hope that there will be questions on this specific issue. Additionally, there can also be special investigations that can be led but for example, special procedures. We have seen this, for example, in the case of Jamal Khashoggi when he was murdered in the strange circumstances. Those types, for example, of investigations by the special rapporteur for extrajudicial executions or other procedures who may have investigative jurisdiction can also be used in this sense. Then regionally, it's also important to understand that this can also be quite complicated at some point. For example, we have the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. They have just received a compliance presented by one of the victims of one of these strikes, directed up before the United States. The Commission is interested in investigating this type of actions. They're, for example, discussing right now a resolution on human rights and organized crime to try to indicate what could be some standards that could be applicable to this ongoing situation. Nevertheless, it is important to understand that when it comes to the United States, the Commission has very limited powers in the sense that, for example, the United States is not a party to the American Convention on Human Rights. And as such, its jurisdiction only falls under the declaration of the American Declaration of Human Rights and Duties of Men, and on the obligations set out in the Charter of the OAS, of the Organization of American States. Nevertheless, it will be important to actually bring this forward, and the Commission should actually promote more knowledge and more openness on these issues. So it will be important, for example, to notice what could be other mechanisms that the Commission could use. For example, it could create a special briefing on this issue. It could call for more thematic hearings on this matter. At the request of somebody in an extreme situation, could call for precautionary measures if needed. So there are avenues that could perhaps trigger some sort of accountability, but more than that, could trigger some sort of paper trail on these actions. And finally, I will say that to ensure justice and accountability in general, there could be a potentiality for discussing universal jurisdiction to be implemented. This means basically that countries who would like to pursue certain types of charges against any of their nationals, or they feel that international non-derogatory norms are being breached, then they could call for the beginning of investigations under universal jurisdiction. This is something that currently in the spaces of Latin America is taking place in several cases. For example, in Argentina, we're seeing universal jurisdiction cases being brought against the Ortega regime, for example. So this could be another possibility. And then we can talk about maybe other avenues that we are still thinking about, but we have to see if they are applicable. For example, the International Court of Justice, but we will see if they are possible, if there is any state that will feel actually kind of concerned about this. And then, for example, in regionally, the OAS, we are having a difficult political moment within the Organization of American States. So seeing that avenue being triggered is going to be also kind of complicated, but it's also it's the sole political, I will say, venue where all the countries in the Americas could actually sit down and discuss this issue. Sadly, I have not seen any rather clear intention of doing that and really talking about this issue. but this is important to look at it. Even if the and just to close, even if the Department of Justice will likely refuse to prosecute these unlawful actions, there is still the need to preserve the evidence and to document everything that has been doing. As it was true in the case of former President Duterte, who, as all we know, is currently sitting at The Hague for crimes. There will be a time for those in power who will have to respond for these human rights violations committed under the guise of the war on drugs. And this is not only in the United States, but all in the rest of the countries in the region. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. Very thorough overview of potential accountability mechanisms, both domestically, regionally, and internationally for us to think about and consider. So we have just over 10 minutes for some Q&A now. Oh, sorry. And I just want to mention that we really welcome Amnesty's important work on the human rights impacts of drug policy and encourage you all to read Amnesty's position on drug policy reform. It was launched last year in 2024, and we'll add a link to that in the chat as well. So I'll move now to some questions, and we've tried to select one key question for each of the panelists. Please, panelists, bear in mind that you have maybe 2 to 3 minutes each to respond. So please keep your answers succinct. So firstly, we'll start with a question for John Walsh. Maybe you can answer these questions together, John. I mean, one question was maybe to share a bit about who is actually on the boats that are being targeted, because you didn't mention that. And then a sort of second question is, we've already seen some countries limiting the intelligence they share with the US in order not to be complicit with the strikes. So, how will the boat strikes, how are they affecting cooperation with other countries, and how may they relate to the Trump administration's defense strategy for Latin America? Over to you, John.
Great. Yeah, I can actually link those answers. I mean, the Trump administration has not provided any evidence to back up its assertions that the people on these boats are even trafficking drugs. They assert it, and there may be good reason to believe that it is the case, but there's no evidence provided to anybody as to who is actually on the boats and what they have on the boats. That said, the people likely to be on these boats are people who know their way around boats and water and the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. And if they are indeed smuggling drugs or moving them from point A to point B, that's what they've been hired to do. And in that sense, they would likely be fishermen looking to make extra money or people who know these routes and are, going to get the product from point A to point B. So the point is, these are not some drug lord capos or sicarios or gunmen on the boats. These are fishermen, and these are people who are being murdered through these lawless strikes and leaving behind families and communities that are mourning them and want answers and deserve answers for what happened. And at the same time, from the point of view of organized crime and drug trafficking networks, are going to be replaced fairly easily. So the idea that the Trump administration in this narrative of going after narco-terrorists is bringing down drug trafficking organizations through these strikes is utterly ridiculous and has no basis, even if they haven't provided evidence. And I think that links to the question about international cooperation is, even if the United States, because the administration is obfuscating the issue with fanciful legal theories, and the Congress is just beginning to dig into what that means. But even if in the United States there's some question of, are we at war? Are this legal? The rest of the world knows that this is blatantly lawless, and these acts are murder, and that to cooperate with them, especially if you're a country that has longstanding intelligence sharing and law enforcement cooperation, risks you becoming complicit in those acts, which are, from the U.S. point of view, These are not deaths that result from these operations. These are deaths that are designed to result from these operations. These are premeditated murders because this is peacetime. And that raises enormous red flags. And from what we understand, clearly there are some countries that have already said we need to limit our cooperation because of the illegality. And then other countries who have close cooperation and have, long-standing law enforcement and intelligence sharing in the Caribbean in particular, um, we understand are talking bilaterally with the United States and warning that this cannot go on and that they can't share their intelligence to support the ongoing law enforcement operation that they would normally do. So I think the upshot is that instead of some great America first, we're tackling narcoterrorism. These kind of operations leave the United States increasingly isolated from its traditional allies in intelligence sharing, including in Latin America, especially Colombia, which has been a long-standing close U.S. ally. And at the same time, because these strikes are so obviously lawless to the rest of the world, the U.S. reputation more generally suffers, including the reputation of the military for operating in a way that is, uh, just to say it, honorable. This is dishonorable for the military to take on this ethos of what Secretary of Defense calls a sort of warrior ethos of lethality. That's not what the military is supposed to be all about. The military is supposed to conduct itself with honor, and this is anything but.
Thank you. Thanks, John. So we'll move now to a question for Giselle. Um, so for Giselle, how do you believe that the people in the communities of Mare have responded to the police raids, and how about the rest of the population?
First of all, our country is still a country that I would say has a lot of consequences of colonization. And so we have a society that is still formed by a commercial media. As I mentioned before, it's in the hands of coronels, the richest elite, the wealthiest elite of the country. So we have a dissemination that Black population is guilty of living in the favela. It's country that did not offer reparations to this Black community with the rights to education. These rights are still very incipient, are still in its very beginnings to attend to the needs of this population. We don't have the right to register our homes, homes that were built by our own hands at the favela. So it's a society that blames us for existing, for living in an alternative way in these favela territories. So, in the whole country of Brazil, we can also consider the peripheries, outskirts of the city, quilombos, rural areas. These are territories that Brazilian society considers us to be guilty for living in those territories, but these are the territories that resist against our country. And these territories are militarized, are controlled, they are surveilled upon, because even the UN Charter is only for a few certain groups in our country, for the white groups. For for them, the UN Charter works because they don't have a helicopter shooting them. They don't have a war tank riding on their streets. But that is not the case of our impoverished populations. For it doesn't cater to the needs of indigenous populations, impoverished outskirts of the city, favelas, that they want to maintain that way. And what we have been doing, Maré, uh, Complexo da Penha, Alemão, they are not attacked by accident. It is there are community mobilizations and coordinations in these favelas. They fight for better education. They have schools. They have community trainings. They have museums. They have political training, capacity building It is not by accident that we suffer so much with military operations. Can you imagine more tanks on your street? Caveirão is the bulletproof car of the police. And they enter the favela saying, I have come to um, arrest your soul. I have come to eradicate your soul. The rich people in our country, they don't die. When there are problems in their homes, they call the police. In the favela, what we suffer is the militarization. We'll never call the police to solve our problems because we know that the police is made to kill us. So, what we continue doing is community communication, data collection, uh, inviting lawyers, legal experts, human rights organizations, and these favelas, Penha, Alemão, and Maré, they have pages on Facebook, social media, that when during operations, the favelas, they self-organize to protect themselves, saying, don't pick up your child at the school right now because there's a shooting going on. Remain at home. And we have organizations today that support us to account for the number of bullets that were shot in a given street, the number of people that were killed. We have the support of legal experts, lawyers, and community communication that help us um, generate a different narrative, but that is very little compared to a country that is betting on militarization. We cannot solve the problem of the military police operations, but we continue self-organizing within our territories to first convince the Black and favela populations that we don't deserve to die. Because that is what they tell us every day. So we still need to make the population itself to humanize themselves against people who dehumanize us every day. Community communication, legal experts, several organizations that support us. And on the days of operations, we have this community generated organizations. Then we get all of those reports. We go to the public defender's office, public prosecutor's office, NPF, the federal government prosecution, when we have national forces invading the favelas. So today we were able to map out who are our allies in seeking for human rights. This is something that 10 years ago we didn't have that. I think that is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gisele. I'm feeling like we really needed more time for this conversation. And I think we will be trying to find ways to continue this discussion, including organizing another panel discussion at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in March on this topic as well. So watch this space. Finally, I'm going to come to Daniel for the last question. And also just to say to panelists, if there are questions for you in the Q&A, you can also respond directly in the Q&A in the text. Sorry that we won't be able to answer all the questions. So Daniel, the last question to you. Does public opinion in America support the bombing of suspected drug boats?
Thank you, Anne. So it's interesting this question because I answered part of it in the chat, but it's concerning because in general, when you talk like, and of course there's the division between young people, older people, Democrats, Republicans, independents, like depending on what's the angle that they use. But there's an overwhelming majority, I would say, that are just not comfortable with how this is being handled, especially for the lack of transparency. And this has been shown in more recent public opinions. But I guess that it is significantly more when this rises in the context of a possible conflict with Venezuela. So in the last couple of weeks, as the Trump administration has been building up its presence near the coast of Venezuela, increasing their presence, for example, in the Vieques military base in Puerto Rico and in other parts of the Caribbean, then like in that framing, the support goes lower. And actually, I will say that the public discourse is changing because of the contradictory messages that the administration has been handling. So, for example, first we see like they went into the race and they won with a message of hope, with a message of the efficiency of the rule of law, that they wanted to bring people to justice for all these crimes and they wanted to clean the streets of drugs and whatnot. But they have been done completely the opposite. One of the first things that President Trump did in his first weeks in office was pardon all the conspirators from January 6th, for example. And then he's been doing these different actions that undermine the capacity of the United States to actually counter drug traffickers and other organized crime structures. So on the one hand, for example, they have been they dismantled all the infrastructure within the State Department that cooperated directly with governments in the region through the INL department, the Department for Drawing from International Narcotics and Rule of Law. This was the department that was in charge of the cooperating agreements with various countries in the region to not only support their police forces, but also support their judicial institutions, their prosecutors, to have this robust investigation and prosecute properly all these people. They stopped that. And more recently, what we saw was the pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was the former president of Honduras, but who had been accused of drug trafficking of almost 400 tons of drugs into the United States. As a response to this, I think was just yesterday, the National Prosecutor of Honduras issued an international warrant for former President Hernandez for his arrest. So public perception has been, I think, changing of how we're framing it, but I will say that people are starting to see that the actions of the administration is not actually leading and is not actually corresponding to what they're actually doing.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, thank you to all of the panelists today for joining us. I'm sorry we're slightly over time. I feel like it's been such an incredible, wide-ranging conversation with such important and, insightful analysis from all of our speakers. I think, in the words of Gisele, like to rehumanize these conversations and to remember that we're talking about people's lives. We're talking, we're taking away from the actions of President Trump that he keeps talking about a war. This is not a war. We are in peacetime, and therefore this is murder, and this is the murder most likely of innocent civilians. And I think, as Daniel has pointed out, there is, some hope for accountability and some shift in public opinion. So thank you so much. Just to end, really part of the aim of this event also was to bring this emerging narco-terrorism narrative into the realm of drug policy and to urge the drug control bodies also to intervene and call out these ongoing violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. As far as we know, neither the International Narcotics Control Board nor the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, or indeed the Commission on Narcotic Drugs itself, which met in Vienna last week, has made any comment about these US military strikes. And this is deeply concerning. The INCB, the International Narcotics Control Board in particular, has established many times that respect for human rights is a prerequisite for respect for the UN drug control conventions, and it has found that extrajudicial killings are also contrary to the drug conventions, which require formal criminal justice responses. And a few years ago, indeed, the INCB took a courageous stance when President Duterte's war on drugs in the Philippines led to extrajudicial killings of tens of thousands of people. And it is essential that the board now takes a similar approach and makes clear that these anti-drug trafficking operations are not an acceptable basis for the international law violations and human rights violations perpetrated by the United States and other countries. So again, thank you for being with us. Thank you again to the panelists. And also, yeah, please watch this space. We very much hope to continue this conversation. And we hope to, be able to reconvene a panel of this nature at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in March next year. So thank you again, and we'll close the webinar here.